I never thought a backyard fountain would turn my quiet neighborhood into a battleground. My name is Jake Morrison, and what started as a simple property improvement project became a 2-year legal nightmare that exposed corruption, fraud, and environmental crimes right in my own backyard. This is the story of how my homeowners association tried to steal my water rights, and how I fought back with everything I had. It all began on a Saturday morning in March. I was standing in my backyard, looking at the natural spring that had been bubbling up from the ground since before the neighborhood was even built. My grandfather had purchased this property back in 1962 specifically because of that spring. He was a hydrologist who understood the value of clean, natural water sources, and he built our family home, positioned to take advantage of this incredible natural resource. The spring produced about 500 gallons per day of crystal clear water that maintained a constant temperature year-round. Over the decades, my family had built a small decorative fountain around the spring, creating a beautiful centerpiece for our backyard that also served as a functional water feature. The fountain attracted birds, supported a small ecosystem of native plants, and provided the soothing sound of flowing water that made our outdoor space feel like a private sanctuary. I had recently inherited the property from my father, and I was planning to restore the fountain system to its original glory. The old stonework needed repair, the pump system required upgrading, and I wanted to add some LED lighting to highlight the natural beauty of the water feature during evening hours. It was going to be my first major home improvement project, and I was excited about preserving this piece of family history while making it my own. That's when Patricia Kellerman showed up at my front door. Patricia was the president of our homeowners association, a position she had held for the past 4 years with an iron fist and a clipboard full of violations. She was a retired real estate agent who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and she had a reputation for making life difficult for anyone who didn't follow her vision of community perfection. "Jake, we need to discuss your backyard water feature," she announced without any pleasantries or small talk. Patricia never knocked and waited for an invitation. She just appeared at your door and started making demands like she owned the place. "The HOA board has concerns about private water features and their impact on community resources." I invited her into my living room, genuinely curious about what concerns she might have. The fountain had been operating for decades without any problems, and it was completely self-contained using the natural spring water. There were no community resources involved, no shared utilities, and no impact on anyone else's property. I couldn't imagine what legitimate concerns the HOA could possibly have. Patricia pulled out a thick folder of documents and spread them across my coffee table with theatrical precision. "We've been conducting a comprehensive review of all water usage in the neighborhood," she explained, pointing to various charts and graphs that looked professionally prepared. "Your fountain system is consuming resources that could be better allocated to community-wide improvements." I stared at the documents, trying to make sense of what she was saying. The fountain used natural spring water that came directly from underground sources on my own property. It didn't connect to any municipal water systems, didn't drain community resources, and had absolutely nothing to do with the HOA's jurisdiction. The whole premise of her concern seemed fundamentally flawed. "Patricia, I'm not sure I understand the issue," I said, examining the charts more carefully. "This is a natural spring that's been here since long before the neighborhood was developed. The water comes from my property and stays on my property? How does that impact community resources?" Patricia's expression shifted into what I came to recognize as her intimidation mode. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her glasses, and adopted the tone of voice she used when she thought she was delivering bad news that people had no choice but to accept. "Jake, you're thinking about this too narrowly. Water is a community resource, regardless of where it originates. The HOA has a responsibility to manage all water usage to ensure fair distribution and environmental sustainability." That statement was so absurd that I actually laughed out loud. Water rights are among the most clearly established property rights in American law, especially when it comes to natural springs located entirely on private property. Patricia was essentially claiming that the HOA had jurisdiction over underground water sources, which was like claiming they had authority over the mineral rights or soil composition of my land. I think there might be some confusion about property rights and HOA authority, I said, walking over to my file cabinet to retrieve my property deed and well rights documentation. The spring is clearly within my property boundaries, and I have established water rights that were recorded when my grandfather first purchased the land. Patricia barely glanced at my documentation before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. Property deeds don't supersede community standards and environmental regulations, she declared, as if she was citing established legal precedent. The board has voted to implement new guidelines for water feature management, and all residents are required to comply. I spent the next hour listening to Patricia explain her vision for centralized water management throughout the neighborhood. According to her plan, all private water features would be connected to a community-controlled distribution system that would ensure equitable access and prevent waste. Individual homeowners would pay fees to access the system, and usage would be monitored and regulated by HOA-appointed contractors. The whole scheme sounded like something out of a dystopian novel, but Patricia presented it with the confidence of someone who believed she had the legal authority to reorganize property rights throughout the entire neighborhood. She had charts showing potential cost savings, diagrams of proposed distribution systems, and what appeared to be contracts with various service providers who would implement and maintain the new infrastructure. This sounds like a fundamental change to property ownership rather than community standards management, I pointed out, reviewing the documents she had brought. You're talking about taking control of water, sources that are located on private property and have been privately owned for decades. Patricia's smile took on a predatory quality that made me uncomfortable. Jake, you can approach this cooperatively, or you can make it difficult for everyone involved. But the board has made its decision, and the new water management system will be implemented regardless of individual preferences. That was the moment I realized this wasn't really about community standards or environmental concerns. Patricia was describing a scheme to take control of valuable natural resources under the guise of HOA authority, and she was using intimidation tactics to pressure residents into compliance. The whole operation felt like a sophisticated scam designed to generate revenue while stripping away property rights. After Patricia left, I spent the evening researching water rights law and HOA authority limitations. What I discovered was that homeowners associations have very specific and limited powers that are clearly defined by state law and individual community covenants. Water rights, especially those involving natural springs on private property, fall well outside the scope of legitimate HOA jurisdiction. I also researched Patricia's background and discovered some interesting information about her previous career in real estate. She had been involved in several disputes with state regulatory agencies regarding disclosure requirements and property rights misrepresentations. There were also complaints filed by former clients alleging that she had misrepresented water rights and utility access in property sales. Monday morning, I called my attorney, David Chen, who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. David had helped several neighbors in our area deal with overzealous homeowners associations, and he had a reputation for not tolerating bureaucratic overreach or intimidation tactics. Jake, what Patricia is describing goes far beyond legitimate HOA authority, David confirmed, after reviewing the documents she had left with me. Water rights are property rights, and they're protected by both state and federal law. An HOA cannot simply declare authority over natural water sources on private property. David explained that legitimate HOA authority is limited to common areas, architectural standards, and community amenities that are specifically defined in the original covenants. Private water sources, especially natural springs that predate the neighborhood development, remain under the exclusive control of the property owner unless there are specific easements or agreements that transfer those rights. The documents Patricia showed you are essentially worthless from a legal standpoint, David continued. She can create all the charts and policies she wants, but she cannot enforce regulations that exceed the HOA's legitimate authority. If she persists with this scheme, she could be facing serious legal consequences for exceeding her authority, and potentially defrauding residents. I felt relieved to have legal confirmation that Patricia's demands were illegitimate, but I also had a growing suspicion that this situation was going to get much more complicated before it was resolved. People like Patricia don't usually back down when their authority is challenged, especially when they've invested significant time and effort into elaborate schemes. Tuesday evening brought the monthly HOA meeting, and I decided to attend to hear Patricia's presentation about the new water management system. I wanted to understand the full scope of what she was planning and see how other residents were responding to her proposals. The meeting was held in the community center conference room, with about 30 residents in attendance. Patricia had prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled Sustainable Water Management for Community Growth, complete with professional-looking slides and impressive-sounding statistics about water, conservation, and cost efficiency. Fellow residents, we have an unprecedented opportunity to modernize our community's approach to water resource management, Patricia began, clicking to her first slide showing aerial photos of various neighborhood properties. By coordinating individual water features under community oversight, we can achieve significant cost savings while ensuring environmental sustainability. I listened to her presentation with growing amazement at the sheer audacity of what she was proposing. Patricia was essentially arguing that the HOA should assume control over all private water sources in the neighborhood, charge residents fees to access their own water, and contract with outside companies to manage the centralized system. The financial projections she presented suggested that residents would save money through the economies of scale achieved by community management, but the numbers didn't account for the fees that would be charged for accessing the system or the costs of connecting private water sources to the community infrastructure. When Patricia opened the floor for questions, I stood up to voice my concerns. Patricia, I'm wondering about the legal authority for this type of water rights management. How does the HOA have jurisdiction over natural springs and private water sources that are located entirely on individual properties? Patricia's response was smooth and rehearsed, suggesting she had anticipated this type of question. Jake, property ownership doesn't grant unlimited authority over natural resources that impact the broader community. Water sources are interconnected, and individual usage affects overall availability. The HOA has both the authority and the responsibility to coordinate resource management for the benefit of all residents. Her answer sounded authoritative, but it was completely wrong from a legal standpoint. Water rights law is extremely well established, and natural springs located entirely on private property remain under the exclusive control of the property owner. The HOA had no more authority over my spring than they had over the trees in my backyard or the soil in my garden. Several other residents asked questions about implementation costs, timeline, and specific requirements for connecting to the community system. Patricia had detailed answers for all the technical questions, suggesting that she had been planning this scheme for months and had already begun negotiating with contractors and service providers. That's when I realized the scope of what Patricia was attempting. This wasn't just about my fountain or even my spring. She was planning to take control of water sources throughout the entire neighborhood, creating a centralized system that would generate ongoing revenue while giving her unprecedented authority over residents' property rights. After the meeting, I approached several neighbors to discuss their thoughts about Patricia's proposals. What I discovered was that most residents had received individual visits from Patricia or her associates, discussing specific water features on their properties and presenting customized versions of the community management plan. Carol Jenkins, an elderly woman who lived 2 streets over, told me that Patricia had visited her home to discuss the small decorative pond in her backyard. She made it sound like I was being selfish by keeping my pond private, Carol explained. She said other residents had complained about the unfairness of some people having water features, while others didn't. Bob Martinez, who had installed a swimming pool the previous year, had been told that his pool was contributing to neighborhood water pressure problems, and that connecting to the community system would solve the issues while reducing his maintenance costs. She had all these official-looking documents about water pressure monitoring and usage optimization, Bob said. It seemed legitimate until I started asking detailed questions. The pattern was clear. Patricia was systematically approaching residents with private water features, using different arguments and pressure tactics depending on each person's specific situation. She was creating artificial problems and then presenting her centralized management system as the solution, all while generating fear about legal compliance and community responsibility. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected development. I was working in my home office when I heard voices in my backyard. Looking out the window, I saw two men in uniforms examining my fountain system and taking photographs. They had clipboards, measuring equipment, and official-looking badges that I couldn't read clearly from inside the house. I went outside to find out what was happening, and the men introduced themselves as water quality inspectors conducting a neighborhood survey. They claimed to be working under contract with the HOA to assess all private water features for compliance with new environmental regulations. "Excuse me, but I didn't authorize any inspection of my property," I said, approaching the men who were now measuring the dimensions of my fountain and recording information about the pump system. "Who exactly are you working for, and what authority do you have to conduct inspections on private property?" The taller inspector, who introduced himself as Mike Stevens, showed me a badge that looked official, but didn't specify any particular agency or jurisdiction. "We're conducting routine compliance inspections as part of the community water management upgrade," he explained, in a tone that suggested I should already know about these inspections. I examined the badge more carefully and noticed that it was generic security company identification rather than any kind of governmental or regulatory authority. The men were essentially private contractors hired by Patricia to gather information about residents' water features, but they were presenting themselves as official inspectors with regulatory authority. "I'm going to need to see some documentation about what specific regulations you're inspecting for," I said, pulling out my phone to record the conversation. "And I'd like clarification about what legal authority you have to access private property for these inspections." The second inspector, who had been quiet until this point, stepped forward with a more aggressive posture. "Sir, we're here on official business regarding community compliance issues. Your cooperation is required, and interference with official inspections could result in significant penalties." That statement confirmed my suspicions that these were not legitimate regulatory inspectors. Real government inspectors would have specific documentation about the regulations they're enforcing, clear identification of their agency authority, and proper procedures for accessing private property. These men were using vague threats and intimidation tactics to conduct unauthorized surveillance. I politely but firmly asked the men to leave my property, informing them that any future inspections would require proper legal documentation and advance notice. They left without argument, but I could see them taking additional photographs as they walked away, documenting my property from the street. That afternoon, I called David Chen to report the unauthorized inspection and get his advice about how to handle future encounters. David was not surprised by this development, as he had seen similar tactics used by overzealous HOAs in other neighborhoods. "Jake, these fake inspections are a common intimidation tactic used to gather information and pressure residents into compliance," David explained. "The goal is to make people feel like they're under official scrutiny, and that resistance will result in legal consequences. It's harassment disguised as official business. David advised me to document all future encounters with Patricia's contractors, refuse access to my property without proper legal authority, and file complaints with both the HOA's management company and local law enforcement if the harassment continued." Thursday morning brought a certified letter from Patricia, written on official HOA letterhead and filled with legal-sounding language about water rights violations and community compliance requirements. The letter accused me of operating an unauthorized water feature that violated community standards and demanded that I cease all water usage pending resolution of the compliance issues. The letter also included a fine of $500 for operating a non-compliant water feature and threatened daily penalties of $50 until the violations were corrected. Patricia was essentially trying to force me to shut down my fountain through financial penalties, while pressuring me to join her centralized management system. I forwarded the letter to David, who immediately recognized it as legal harassment designed to intimidate me into submission. "This is completely without legal foundation," David confirmed. "Patricia has no authority to impose fines for water rights usage, and the violations she's citing don't exist under any legitimate regulatory framework." David drafted a response letter that clearly stated my legal position regarding water rights, challenged the HOA's authority to regulate natural springs on private property, and demanded that Patricia cease all harassment activities. The letter also put Patricia on notice that continued overreach would result in legal action for exceeding her authority and violating my property rights. Friday evening brought another surprise visit, this time from Patricia herself, accompanied by the two fake inspectors from earlier in the week. They arrived just as I was finishing dinner, and Patricia's demeanor was noticeably more aggressive than during our previous encounters. "Jake, we've been more than patient with your non-compliance, but this situation needs to be resolved immediately," Patricia announced, gesturing toward my backyard as if the fountain was some kind of hazardous violation. "The inspection report indicates serious problems with your water feature that pose risks to community health and safety." I asked to see the inspection report, and Patricia handed me a document that looked professional, but was filled with vague language about water quality concerns and environmental compliance issues. The report claimed that my fountain was contributing to groundwater contamination and creating mosquito breeding conditions that threatened neighborhood health. The allegations in the report were completely fabricated. My fountain used a closed-loop system that recycled the natural spring water without any discharge or contamination potential. The water quality was excellent, and the system was designed to prevent standing water that could support mosquito breeding. The report was pure fiction designed to create justification for Patricia's regulatory authority. "This report contains false information about my water feature," I said, comparing the document to the actual fountain system that was clearly visible in my backyard. "The allegations don't match the physical reality of how the system operates, and the conclusions aren't supported by any actual testing or legitimate inspection procedures." Patricia's fake inspectors tried to reinforce the authority of their report by referencing various regulations and technical standards, but their explanations were full of contradictions and technical errors that revealed their lack of genuine expertise. They were essentially actors following a script rather than qualified professionals conducting legitimate assessments. That's when I decided to call Patricia's bluff in a very direct way. I pulled out my phone and called the county health department, asking to speak with someone about water quality inspections and regulatory compliance for private water features. I'd like to verify the authority and credentials of some inspectors who claim to be conducting water quality assessments in my neighborhood. I explained to the county official, "Can you confirm whether your department has contracted with private companies to conduct these inspections?" The county health department confirmed that they had not authorized any private contractors to conduct water quality inspections in my area, and that legitimate inspections would be conducted by county employees with proper identification and documentation. The fake inspectors Patricia had hired had no governmental authority whatsoever. I put the call on speakerphone so Patricia and her contractors could hear the county official's explanation of proper inspection procedures and regulatory authority. The expressions on their faces as they realized their deception had been exposed was almost worth the weeks of harassment I had endured. "Patricia, it appears that your inspectors have been misrepresenting their authority and conducting unauthorized surveillance on private property," I said, ending the call with the county health department. "That's not community management. That's fraud and trespassing." Patricia tried to maintain her authoritative demeanor, but I could see the confidence draining from her expression as she realized that her intimidation tactics had been exposed. "The specific details of inspection authority don't change the fundamental issues with your water feature," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction she had displayed during previous encounters. The fake inspectors made a hasty exit, clearly uncomfortable with being exposed as fraudulent, but Patricia lingered for a few more minutes trying to salvage some authority from the situation. She threatened legal action, promised continued enforcement efforts, and suggested that my resistance was harming community relations. Patricia, I think it's time for you to consult with a lawyer about the legal boundaries of HOA authority, I replied calmly, because what you're describing isn't community management. It's an attempt to seize private property rights through intimidation and fraud. That weekend, I decided to do some deeper research into Patricia's background and the contractors she was working with. What I discovered was much more concerning than simple HOA overreach. Patricia had connections to a network of service companies that specialized in water management systems, and she appeared to have financial interests in the businesses that would benefit from her centralized management scheme. The fake inspection company was owned by Patricia's brother-in-law, who had no legitimate credentials in water quality assessment or environmental regulations. The proposed management system would be operated by a company that Patricia had helped establish, using her real estate industry connections. The entire operation was designed to generate revenue for Patricia and her associates while giving them control over valuable natural resources throughout the neighborhood. I also discovered that Patricia had attempted similar schemes in 2 previous neighborhoods where she had served as HOA president. In both cases, she had been forced to resign after residents uncovered evidence of financial impropriety and exceeded authority. The pattern suggested that Patricia was systematically targeting communities with valuable natural resources and using her HOA positions to facilitate elaborate theft schemes. Monday morning, I filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office regarding HOA corruption and fraud, the County Sheriff's Department regarding trespassing and impersonation of government officials, and the State Real Estate Commission regarding Patricia's misuse of industry connections. I provided all the documentation I had collected, including recordings of conversations, fake inspection reports, and evidence of Patricia's financial interests in the proposed management companies. I also contacted an investigative journalist who specialized in HOA corruption stories, providing background information about Patricia's scheme, and suggesting that this might be part of a broader pattern affecting multiple communities. The journalist was very interested in the story, especially the environmental aspects and the sophisticated nature of the fraud operation. Tuesday afternoon brought a visit from Detective Sarah Coleman with the County Sheriff's Department. Detective Coleman specialized in white-collar crime investigations, and she was following up on the complaints I had filed regarding Patricia's activities. Mr. Morrison, we've been investigating several similar complaints about HOA overreach and fraudulent inspection schemes, Detective Coleman explained. Your case appears to be part of a larger pattern that we've been tracking across multiple jurisdictions. Detective Coleman confirmed that Patricia and her associates were under investigation for multiple violations, including fraud, trespassing, impersonation of government officials, and conspiracy to commit theft. The investigation had expanded beyond our neighborhood to include Patricia's activities in previous communities where she had attempted similar schemes. We'd like your permission to install some surveillance equipment on your property to document any future harassment or intimidation attempts, Detective Coleman requested. This type of evidence would be extremely valuable for building a comprehensive case against the entire operation. I agreed to cooperate with the investigation, and Detective Coleman arranged for discrete surveillance cameras to monitor my property and document any future visits from Patricia or her contractors. The equipment was virtually invisible and would provide high-quality video evidence of any trespassing or harassment activities. Wednesday evening brought the next monthly HOA meeting, and I decided to attend to observe Patricia's presentation about the water management system, now that I knew the full scope of her fraudulent operation. I was curious to see whether she would continue promoting the scheme or modify her approach in response to the increased scrutiny. The meeting room was more crowded than usual, with several new faces that I didn't recognize from the neighborhood. I later learned that these were other property owners who had been researching Patricia's background and had come to observe her presentation with newly informed perspectives. Patricia's presentation was notably different, from her previous month's confident promotion of the water management system. She seemed nervous and defensive, spending considerable time addressing misunderstandings about HOA authority and misinformation about the proposed system's legal foundation. There have been some questions raised about the implementation of our water management improvements, Patricia began, her usual commanding tone replaced by a more cautious approach. I want to clarify that all our initiatives are conducted within proper legal frameworks and with full respect for property rights. The change in Patricia's demeanor was striking. Gone was the confident authority she had displayed during our previous encounters. Instead, she seemed to be making excuses and trying to reframe her proposals in response to challenges she hadn't anticipated. When the presentation opened for questions, several residents immediately challenged Patricia's authority to regulate private water sources. Carol Jenkins, the elderly woman with the decorative pond, stood up and read from legal research she had conducted about water rights and HOA limitations. Patricia, I've been researching the legal issues you mentioned during your visit to my home, Carol said, holding up printouts of state regulations and legal precedents. According to multiple sources, HOAs have no authority over private water sources that are located entirely on individual properties. Can you explain what specific legal framework gives you the authority you've been claiming? Patricia's response was evasive and filled with vague references to environmental regulations and community standards, but she couldn't cite any specific legal authority for her proposed water management system. Her explanations became increasingly contradictory as residents pressed for concrete details about the legal foundation for her claims. Bob Martinez, the neighbor with the swimming pool, had prepared even more detailed questions about the technical aspects of Patricia's proposed system. I've consulted with several pool maintenance companies about your claims regarding water pressure and community distribution systems, Bob announced. None of them could identify any technical benefits to centralizing private water features, and several expressed concern about the potential for system contamination and reduced water quality. The technical challenges to Patricia's proposals were devastating because they revealed that her scheme wasn't just legally questionable, it was also, technically, unsound and potentially harmful to the very water quality she claimed to be protecting. As the questions continued, Patricia became increasingly defensive and hostile. She accused residents of spreading misinformation, challenged their qualifications to understand technical issues, and suggested that opposition to the water management system was motivated by selfishness rather than legitimate concerns. This community has a choice, Patricia declared, her voice rising with frustration. We can work together to implement modern resource management solutions, or we can allow individual property owners to waste valuable resources while the rest of the neighborhood suffers from inefficient water usage. That statement revealed the fundamental flaw in Patricia's entire approach. She was presenting water resource management as a zero-sum competition between individual property rights and community welfare, when in reality, private water features had no negative impact on community resources or other residents' water access. The meeting ended with several residents announcing their intention to research Patricia's proposals independently and consult with legal experts about HOA authority limitations. The unified opposition that emerged during that meeting was the beginning of the end for Patricia's water management scheme. Thursday morning brought the most dramatic development yet. I was reviewing emails when I heard vehicle doors slamming in my driveway. Looking out the window, I saw Detective Coleman along with several other law enforcement officers approaching my house. Mr. Morrison, we're here to execute a search warrant on Patricia Kellerman's property, Detective Coleman explained. We wanted to inform you because the warrant includes the right to access your property to document the water feature that's been central to her fraudulent claims. The search warrant was based on evidence that Patricia had been operating an elaborate fraud scheme involving multiple properties and fake inspection companies. The investigation had expanded to include federal charges related to mail fraud and wire fraud, as Patricia had been using electronic communications and the postal service to facilitate her schemes. I watched from my backyard, as law enforcement officers documented my fountain system, took water samples for testing, and photographed the natural spring to establish the legitimate nature of my water rights. The contrast between this professional, authorized inspection and Patricia's fake surveillance was striking. Later that morning, I saw Patricia being escorted from her home in handcuffs as law enforcement officers carried boxes of documents and computer equipment from her house. The sight of her arrest was surreal after months of her presenting herself as an unquestionable authority figure who could impose her will on the entire neighborhood. The search of Patricia's home uncovered extensive evidence of her fraudulent operations, including contracts with fake inspection companies, financial records showing her personal profit from the proposed management systems, and communications with associates in other communities where similar schemes had been attempted. Detective Coleman later explained that Patricia's operation was much more sophisticated than initially apparent. She had been working with a network of associates who targeted communities with valuable natural resources, used HOA positions to gain access and credibility, and implemented elaborate fraud schemes designed to transfer property rights while generating ongoing revenue streams. This type of organized fraud is becoming increasingly common as property values rise and natural resources become more valuable, Detective Coleman explained. Patricia's group had attempted similar schemes in at least 6 different communities over the past decade. The investigation also revealed that Patricia's fake inspectors had been conducting unauthorized surveillance on multiple properties throughout the neighborhood, gathering information about water features, landscaping improvements, and other valuable property elements that could be targeted for fraudulent regulation schemes. Friday afternoon brought a certified letter from the HOA's management company, announcing Patricia's removal as president and the suspension of all water management initiatives pending legal review. The letter also included an apology to residents who had been subjected to harassment or intimidation during Patricia's tenure. The new interim HOA leadership immediately announced that they would be conducting a comprehensive audit of all activities undertaken during Patricia's presidency, with particular attention to financial transactions and contractor relationships that appeared to benefit Patricia personally rather than the community as a whole. I felt enormous relief that Patricia's harassment campaign had finally ended. But I also realized that the legal proceedings were just beginning. Patricia faced multiple felony charges that could result in significant prison time, and there would likely be civil lawsuits from residents who had been defrauded or harassed during her scheme. The following Monday brought a visit from FBI agents who were investigating the interstate aspects of Patricia's operation. The scheme had crossed state lines and involved mail fraud, making it a federal case that would be prosecuted by U.S. attorneys rather than local prosecutors. Mr. Morrison, your case appears to have been the catalyst that exposed a much larger criminal operation, Agent Rebecca Torres explained. Patricia Kellerman and her associates have been operating similar schemes in multiple states, targeting communities with valuable natural resources and using HOA positions to facilitate sophisticated fraud operations. The FBI investigation revealed that Patricia's network had successfully implemented their fraud schemes in several other communities, extracting hundreds of thousands of dollars from residents while gaining control over valuable water rights and other natural resources. My resistance to Patricia's demands had prevented her from completing her scheme in our neighborhood and had provided the evidence needed to shut down the entire operation. Agent Torres requested my continued cooperation with the federal investigation, including testimony about Patricia's methods and the evidence I had collected during her harassment campaign. I agreed to participate fully, understanding that my experience could help protect other communities from similar fraud schemes. The federal charges against Patricia included conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud, and violations of federal environmental protection laws related to her schemes involving water resources. The potential penalties were severe, with the possibility of decades in federal prison if she was convicted on all charges. Over the next several months, the investigation uncovered the full scope of Patricia's criminal network. She had been working with corrupt contractors, fraudulent inspection companies, and even some legitimate businesses that had been deceived about the legal authority behind her schemes. The financial analysis revealed that Patricia had personally profited by over $300,000 from her various fraud schemes, money that had been extracted from homeowners who believed they were paying for legitimate community improvements or regulatory compliance. The environmental assessment of my property confirmed that my fountain system posed no threats to community water resources or environmental safety. In fact, the natural spring was found to be an invaluable ecological asset that supported local wildlife and contributed to the overall environmental health of the area. The final resolution came 8 months after Patricia's initial visit to my home. She pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations into her criminal network. The plea agreement resulted in a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by supervised probation and restitution payments to victims of her schemes. The HOA's insurance company covered most of the costs associated with Patricia's fraudulent activities, including legal fees for residents who had been harassed and financial penalties for the association's role in facilitating her scheme. New governance procedures were implemented to prevent future abuse of HOA authority. My fountain was restored to full operation with some additional improvements funded by the settlement with Patricia's criminal network. The natural spring continues to provide beautiful, clean water that attracts wildlife and creates a peaceful centerpiece for my backyard. The most satisfying aspect of the resolution was seeing the community come together to resist fraud and protect property rights. What started as my individual battle against Patricia's harassment became a neighborhood-wide effort to expose corruption and hold criminals accountable. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Patricia's initial visit to my home was the beginning of an attempted theft that could have cost me thousands of dollars and the loss of water rights that had been in my family for decades. Her sophisticated fraud scheme was designed to appear legitimate while systematically stripping away property rights through intimidation and fake authority. The key lesson I learned is that resistance to fraud and corruption is not just about protecting your own interests, it's about protecting the entire community from criminals who exploit positions of trust to steal from honest people. Patricia's scheme succeeded in other communities because residents didn't recognize the fraud or didn't have the resources to fight back effectively. My experience also demonstrated the importance of understanding your legal rights and seeking professional help when facing intimidation or harassment from authorities who exceed their legitimate jurisdiction. David Chen's legal expertise was essential for recognizing that Patricia's demands were illegitimate and for building the case that eventually led to her prosecution. The support I received from neighbors like Carol Jenkins and Bob Martinez was equally important. Individual resistance to fraud can be effective, but collective action is much more powerful and harder for criminals to overcome through intimidation tactics. Today, my fountain operates peacefully in my backyard, surrounded by the natural beauty that my grandfather recognized when he first purchased this property decades ago. The water continues to flow from the natural spring, supporting local wildlife and providing the soothing sounds that make my outdoor space feel like a sanctuary. Patricia Kellerman is serving her federal prison sentence, and her criminal network has been dismantled. The communities that were victimized by her schemes have recovered most of their losses through restitution payments and insurance settlements. Most importantly, our neighborhood has stronger protections against future fraud schemes and a better understanding of the legitimate limits of HOA authority. The experience brought the community closer together and created a network of residents who are prepared to resist future attempts at corruption or abuse of power. The fountain that started this entire conflict continues to bubble peacefully in my backyard, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not over grand principles, but over the simple right to enjoy the natural resources that belong to you and your family. Water, as my grandfather always said, finds its own level, and justice, I learned, has a similar way of flowing toward the truth. No matter how many obstacles are placed in its path, Patricia tried to steal my water rights, but instead she lost her freedom. That seems like justice to me.